Channel, Zelda Wolf, where we're in a deep study on the book of Micah. We've covered a lot of material in terms of understanding that 8th century period and also understanding the nature of idolatry, the nature of sin, and certainly the doctrine of humanity. So that's to help position us in a place where we can appreciate what's happening in the text. Last week, if you watched last week's video, you know that we talked about the justice of God, and we see that God's justice begins to descend on Samaria and later on Judah in terms of the Syrian campaign. That was rolling over the ancient Near East region. Well, it has come all the way into that northern Israel and later Judah because of the idolatry that God's people were so persistent in practicing. We know that we've kind of gone over all of the warnings that took place, which was over 250 years. God had warned his people to stop acting in this manner, and of course they did not listen. So today we are going farther into Micah chapter 1, but I wanted for us to really think about a couple of things. Number one, if you were to go today and let's say you were in wherever you're located, you were to survey 15, 20 churches as people came out of their churches, and you were able to survey them and ask them, what is God like? I wonder what would be the consensus. What would people say that God's like? I would actually love to do something like that. Well, that's one question. And the other question is, could you help me understand the nature of idolatry? Well, I hope those two questions are two questions that you could answer as a result of what we've studied so far, because they're really, really important. It's very crucial that we say the same things about God that the scriptures say about God. And so I wanted to start us off on a contextual note, meaning where we are today. So I wanted to read an excerpt from A.W. Tozer. It's from The Knowledge of the Holy. This is actually a book, really three of his books in one. It's The Knowledge of the Holy, The Pursuit of God, and God's Pursuit of Man, which is a really good read. I hope you will take time to maybe go order one of these books, or like I did, I ordered the whole thing. And I'm going to read this first little bit as we get into our study today. So this is from A.W. Tozer in The Knowledge of the Holy. So the man who comes to a right belief about God is relieved of 10,000 temporal problems, for he sees at once that these have to do with matters which at the most cannot concern him for very long. But even if multiple burdens of time may be lifted from him, the one mighty single burden of eternity begins to press down upon him with a weight more crushing than all of the woes in the world piled upon one another. That mighty burden is his obligation to God. It includes an instant and lifelong duty to love God with every power of your mind and soul, and to obey him perfectly, and to worship him acceptably. And when the man's laboring conscience tells him that he has done none of these things, but has from childhood been guilty of foul revolt against the majesty in heaven, the inner pressure of self-accusation may become too heavy to bear. Here's where we come into play. But the gospel can lift this destroying burden from the mind and give beauty for ashes and the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. But unless that weight of the burden is felt, the gospel can mean nothing to that man. And until he sees a vision of God high and lifted up, there will be no woe and no burden. Low views of God destroy the gospel. for all who hold them. That excerpt, I'm going to read more here in just a minute, but that excerpt's really important because in our day and time, we preach a love hermeneutic. And of course, through the New Testament, we're talking about the gospel sometimes, at least sometimes we are, but a love hermeneutic. That love, preaching the love of Christ without helping people understand the state in which they are in prior to receiving Christ is very difficult for people to actually appreciate the love of Christ and what he has done. So it's important for people to understand where they are in position before God so that they can appreciate the gospel. So on here, among the sins to which the human heart is prone, hardly any other is more hateful to God than idolatry. For idolatry is at the bottom level of his character. The idolatrous heart assumes that God is other than he is, and itself is also a very monstrous sin, and substitutes the true God, the one made after his own likeness. Always this God will conform to the image of the one who created it and will be base or pure, cruel or kind, according to the moral state of the mind from which it emerges. A God begotten in the shadows of a fallen heart will quite naturally be no true likeness of the true God. Thou thoughtest, said the Lord to the wicked man in the psalm, that I was altogether such like you. Well, surely this must be a serious affront to the Most High God, before whom cherubim and seraphim continually cry, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. The essence of idolatry is the entertainment of thoughts about God that are completely unworthy of him. Wrong ideas about God are not only the fountain from which the polluted waters of idolatry flow, they are themselves idolatrous. The idolater simply imagines things about God and acts as if they were true. The masses of her adherents come to believe that God is different from what he actually is, and that is heresy of the most insidious and deadly kind. The heaviest obligation lying upon the Christian church today is to purify and evaluate her concept of God until it is once again worthy of him. So I wanted to start us out on that today because we really need to think rightly about God so that we are living in accordance with that reality. So we are starting in Micah again. We only got really to, I think, verse 6 in Micah. And so as you see on your screen with the PowerPoint, we are in the middle of the fall of Samaria. So what is happening here? Let's look at verse 6. And it says, Therefore I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the countryside, a planting area for a vineyard. I will roll her stones into a valley and expose her foundations. All her carved images will be smashed to pieces. All her wages will be burned in the fire. I will destroy all of her idols. Since she collected the wage of a prostitute, they will be used again for a prostitute. So what we are seeing here is the fall of the Sumerian of Samaria, and we see that this is occurring by the hands of the Assyrian Empire. And we had our first Assyrian leader named Tiglath-Pileser III, who has died, and his son Shalmaneser V has taken up the throne. And in 2 Kings chapter 17, the Bible gives us the description, a very quick description of the sack of Samaria. So let's turn to 17, 1 through 6. It says, In the 12th year of Judah's king Ahaz, Hoshea, son of Elah, became king over Israel and Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. King Shalmaneser of Assyria attacked him, and Hoshea became his vassal and paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria caught Hoshea in a conspiracy. He sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and who had not paid tribute to the king of Syria as in previous years. Therefore, the king of Assyria arrested him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the whole land and marched up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. And so you see that this is what's happening in Micah chapter 1, that they're coming in and they're destroying Nineveh, and it took 3 years to lay siege to that fortified city of Samaria. And if you recall, we talked quite extensively about the cruelty of the Assyrian Empire. They were highly trained leaders, highly trained soldiers, and but they were very cruel people. They did horrible things to people. And especially if they were taking over an area and those people didn't relent immediately, if they had to besiege them for any length of time, they would really act out their cruelty in full force. So we see that they besieged them, they invaded, looted, and killed, and the deportation occurred, and over 27,000 people were taken prisoners and were relocated and resettled in different regions. If you remember when we talked about Assyrian foreign policy, one of the brilliance of their foreign policy is they had this whole system where they would go into an area, and if the people didn't comply at the third stage of that policy, they would deport them and then relocate them in a different place and bring in other regions of people and resettle the area. And part of why that was so successful is because it unhinged people from their national fidelity, the fidelity to their national way of life, and even to their gods. And so they repopulated vast areas by doing this. So her carved images in verse 8 or 7 were evidence against God's people for their idolatry, their idolatrous worship. Israel's spiritual sickness degenerated into a defiled status of adopting temple prostitutes in Samaria. And we, of course, read some of that last week in 2 Kings chapter 17. Really, the litany of accusations that is the kinds of things that they were doing that were abomination to God. One of those, well, this is certainly one of them, but another one was that they would cast their children into the fires, making sacrifice to these gods. So, Baalism was a big part of that worship. And so Baalism was also backed by Israel's government, and it was supported by the official status. They had their official prophets of Baal and Asherah. And so that northern kingdom, if you remember, they built a temple to Baal, and for a long time people had the choice to either go to worship Yahweh or worship Baal and even some other gods. Well, this is exactly what God had been warning them against for a really long time. So as a result, so now what we're seeing is the results of what happened as a result of their idolatry. I'd said at some point that when we don't really get away with anything. People don't get away with anything in the end. And when you're tempted to do things that God says not to do, remember Satan will show you the bait, but he won't show you the hook. And so this is exactly what happened to Israel as they took the bait all of those years of this idolatrous worship and even the debauchery that they participated in. And it led to their total destruction. So what we're seeing is the result of Samaria's fall is destruction, the deportation, and desolation and displacement. Now, part of the desolation was when they removed so many people uh, as they repopulated them. They left so few people in that region at that time that lions came in and multiplied out of control. And this was a part of the fulfillment of God's warning in Leviticus when it spoke of lions coming and being a problem. So Israel had become very desolate, and of course the displacement. It was, all those people were taken away. So, but perhaps the worst that the Israelites would have seen as a result of what happened is Israel's political history had ended as they were absorbed into the surrounding nations that they sought to be a part of. And so you just have to understand the irony of God's judgment here. It's quite thick and really poignant, because here we have Israel lusted after all these other nations. They wanted to be like the other nations. They served the nations, their other gods, and God had told them over and over, do not take for yourselves the gods of these nations. Separate yourself from them. And they did not do that. So the judgments of God, Israel did not want God nor his laws, but wanted to be like the nations around them as they dedicated themselves to those gods in their heinous practices. So God gave it to them. They became the nations forever. Hence, in a very real way, they became what they worshiped. See, one of the themes about idolatry is that you become what you worship. And so what happens is you had these people, God's people had lusted after this activity for 250 years. And God had tried to negotiate with them, tried to get them turned from the ways. He had sent prophet after prophet to warn them to stop acting in these ways and to turn back to him. Well, they wanted to be like these nations, but in the final judgment of God, they became the nations. They didn't become like them, they became them. They were so absorbed into all of those nationalities because of the deportation and the resettlement that they never again became a political entity. God had actually cut them out of the covenant promises. And so this was devastating, of course. Like this is what happens with sin, is once people give themselves over to sins for long periods of time, and they can be sure that they're practicing idolatry. Well, they will eventually find a level of destruction that results from that. So, of course, as a group, as a population, they became what they worshipped. The shock and the tragedy of this collapse of the northern kingdom was so severe. The writer of 2 Kings had a list of reasons why God's judgment on Samaria was necessary and it was deserved. We read that last week, that 2 Kings 17, 1 through 18. Go back and read that again and review as to why they were so severely judged. And so they were severed from the covenant promises, although the covenant remained intact for Judah. And don't you know that this being cut out of the promise really echoes that first generation when God was bringing his people out of Egypt? And remember, he said, you will enter the promised land if you, obey the commands and do and act the way my people should act. And he had given Moses the 10 Commandments. He had given the people great leaders in Moses and Aaron and Miriam. And they did not listen. They wanted to go back to Israel. They wanted to go back to Egypt, and they wanted to eat the meat that Egypt would provide for their slaves. And so they kept going on and on, that God allowed them to wander because of their disbelief, their unbelief in God. He allowed them to wander in the desert for 40 years. And he said, you know what? You will not enter the promised land, but the generation after you shall have that privilege. And so you can see how this covenant, this cutting out of the people from the covenant promises was echoed. This echoes that first idolatrous people. And, that really makes you think about when Paul was talking about, I think it's in Romans chapter 9, where he makes a statement. He said, not all of Israel was Israel, and not all of the Israelites were sons and daughters of Abraham. And in the like way, we can say, even within our Christian communities, not everyone who proclaims to be a Christian belong to Christ. We know that those who belong to Christ follow after Christ. And so this is kind of a very important lesson for us to realize, even in our present day. So as we get to verse 8, I feel like we should be farther along here, but we've really taken some time in our journey. That between verse 7 and verse 8, there's a lapse of 2 decades which have been telescoped. So what Micah is doing is in 722 or 721, the Syrian campaign laid waste to Samaria. So in 701, which is 2 decades later, the Syrian leadership took a target at Judah. They were headed toward Judah now. So in this second part of the first chapter, Micah has Samaria in view, but he also has his people, Judah, in view as well. So you have to realize that Micah's heart, just like Jeremiah's, was broken. And let's read his lament here in verse 8. It says, this is Micah. He says, because of this, I will lament and wail. I will walk barefoot and naked. I will howl like the jackals and mourn like the ostriches. For her wound is incurable and has reached even Judah. It has approached my people's city gate as far as Jerusalem. So we see this is Micah's lament, and Jeremiah lamented as well. We're going to look at his lament. Okay, so Jeremiah came after Micah 100 years later, and he's talking to Jerusalem. He's saying to them, you saw what happened to Samaria. You saw what happened to Judah. And would you not listen to the words of Micah? And so this is what Jeremiah, his lament, is saying. So listen to his words. And this is in Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 18 through chapter 9, verse 3. He says, my joy has flown away. Grief has settled upon me. My heart is sick. Listen, the cry of my dear people from faraway land. Is the Lord no longer in Zion, her king within her? Why have they angered me? This is the Lord. Why have they angered me with their carved images, with their worthless foreign idols? Harvest has passed, summer has ended, but we have not been saved. And that's to bespeak this whole harvest is gone, the summer is gone. It's to bespeak that it's no longer too late to repent. That God had warned them for all of this time, and now they were thinking that God was going to save them from this devastation, and He did not. It was actually His judgment upon them. And He says, I am broken by the brokenness of my dear people. I mourn. Horror has taken hold of me. Is there no balm of Gilead? Is there no physician there? So why has the healing of my dear people not come about? In chapter 9, verse 1. If my head were flowing spring, my eyes a fountain of tears, I would weep day and night. This is why he was called the weeping prophet. I would abandon my people and depart from them, for they are all idolaters and solemn assembly of all treacherous people. He's describing his people here. And he says in verse 3, they bent their tongues like their bows. Lies and not faithfulness prevail in the land. And so what he's really communicating is the ear markers of the people, the characteristics of the people are that they are liars, they are deceitful, and it's from the top down and down to the very top. We have the corrupt officials that we'll get more into as we start reading more in Micah, but we have the corruption that's been established, the oppression of the farmers, and he's identifying these people with deceit and lying. This is really interesting because it's not that they have told a lie or they've said a lie here or there, but that they are so identified with their sins that that's actually what their identity has become. And so, and that's interesting because in the New Testament we hear that that Satan is the father of lies. And so lying and deceit are these activities that not only have made up these people, but they've unraveled reality with their lies and their deceit. They've cheated and they've made things look certain ways, and they've used their corruption, their manipulation. And part of this description, he talks about their lies as if it's an archery event. He says their lies are like their bows. So what he's also communicating is this expertise that they demonstrate in their lies, in their deceptions. They're highly manipulative as a people, individually and corporately, and they are experienced in this identity mindset. So, and he says, so they proceed from one evil to another. And so then the Lord says, and they do not take me into account. This is the Lord's declaration. And so we see Micah's, both Micah and Jeremiah, they both identify with their people while they're also repulsed by their idolatry. So one of the things that you see with Micah's lament is we have a couplet. You have a first couplet, a second couplet, and a third couplet. So the first couplet says, lament and wail. The second couplet is walk barefoot and naked. And number 3 is howl like the jackals and mourn like the ostriches. Well, the first couplets include 2 verbs that are nearly always used to connote mourning for the dead. This signifies cries of anguish, for they foresee the coming calamity of God's people in Judah. This is Micah's people, his own people. Remember, he was from Moresheth, and so this was going to happen to his people. So this lament and anguish over Israel and Judah are shared with various prophets. We just saw the one with Jeremiah. And I do want to point out the lament with Isaiah in Isaiah 5. That's the scripture we read last week when Isaiah was showing us that God had a vineyard. The vineyard were God's people. And God was the owner of that vineyard. Well, in verse 12 it says, they did not perceive the Lord's actions. They do not see the work of his hands. And Jeremiah, we just read, noted that they did not take me into account. So what you see is this burgeoning theme of they can no longer see or hear and perceive the actions of God. So let's look at this this in Jesus's lament over Israel in Luke chapter 19. Luke chapter 19, Jesus is weeping over Israel. And listen to what he says. He says in chapter 19, verse 41, as he approached and saw the city, he wept for it, saying, if you knew this day what would bring peace, but now it is hidden from your eyes. For the days will come on you when your enemies will build a barricade around you, surround you, and hem you in on every side. Verse 44, they will crush you and your children among you to the ground, and they will not leave one stone unturned in your midst, because you did not recognize the time when God visited you. See, they too, during that first century, they did not recognize God visiting them through Jesus Christ. And so what you see is this lack of recognition in all of these prophets, and of course Jesus being the Son of God. And that's interesting, because with Jesus, we know that came to fruition, what he was prophesying there in AD 70 with the sack of Israel or Jerusalem by the Romans. And they certainly, they tore down the temple, and truly not a stone was on top of another. They destroyed that, and it was devastating, of course, and that temple was never again a part of the fabric of Israel. So you see this lack of detection of God, and what does that communicate to us? I mean, as Christians, are we detecting the signs of the times that we live in now? As the Christian body of the corporate body of believers, and this is a global, when I'm speaking of corporate, the global body of Christ. We certainly, as a body of Christ, need to recognize where we are in our day and time, and the dangers that Christianity faces in terms of her participating in idolatry as well. So a note on that last couplet. The last couplet, howl like the jackals and mourn like the ostriches, include the two animals typically found on the fringe of the inhabited places, perhaps signaling Judah's coming desolation. So we see Micah's giving a pictorial to us, really, of what's going to happen. And you hear him talking about walking around howling and stuff. And so he and Isaiah probably actually did that because the prophets were instructed to do these kinds of activities to gather the attention of the people so that they would understand what was coming. There's nothing that God didn't do to try to get their attention. So in verse 9, we see that her wound is incurable. That's very scary, because what that means is she was marked for total destruction, which cannot be overturned, for God has set his wrath upon her. So remember that at this point in time, they're experiencing, you know good and well, when that siege began from Samaria, they probably started thinking, maybe the Lord's going to save us because we're supposed to be God's people. But of course, they didn't realize that God allowed Assyria to be his arm of discipline. And this really begs the question. A lot of people ask these questions, like here's one of them: How could God do such heinous things to his own people? And so it's very important to know that God is not the author of the Assyrians' sinful cruelty, but he allowed these people to act out of their own volition, but he used it to his own ends. So what you're seeing happen is that God's people refuse to listen. So God, he donned his surgical mask. He laid hold of his scalpel, and he began to cut out the spiritual cancer from his people. And that scalpel was Assyria. And so he had to cut out that deadly growth, because God was developing his people to a place where he would deliver the Messiah through the line of Judah, and through his people. And so to make that development come to fruition, he had to remove the cancerous cell that had eaten up the healthy tissue or the healthy fabric of God's people. And that's exactly what God has done. We'll see in a minute God's response to Assyria, because just because Syria did what they were inclined to do, and God allowed that to happen, it does not mean that God did not judge Assyria. So we have to realize that God is the great judge. He's holy and he's righteous. And although he will allow people to do things, it doesn't mean that they are going to not experience his wrathful hand. So, so the wound conveys the widespread slaughter resulting from the onslaught of war and the deportation that Samaria experienced. So it has reached even Judah. This is a really important aspect because Judah, remember, it was in northern Israel and southern Judah. And southern Judah had the capital city was Jerusalem. Well, that's really important because Judah is part of Judah, which is Jerusalem. Jerusalem would be saved, but I want you to hear about these 46 Judean cities that were taken by Sennacherib. Remember, he turned his attention, of course, Shalmaneser and Sargon II attacked Samaria. Then 20 years later, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, turned his eyes toward Judah. And he, if you recall, we talked about the documentation that the Assyrians were serious about keeping when they did their conquest. They certainly wanted their greatness to be known, immortalized in these prisms that they would engrave upon stone, and we actually have those. And so the Taylor's prism is one of those documentations that Sennacherib detailed in his taking of these 46 cities. So let me read a portion of that Taylor's prism, and I'll kind of skip around here. It says, and this is Sennacherib, in my third campaign, I marched against, and he lists all of these kings. He's talking about Egypt and Sidon and all these places. And he said, whom the terror of my, I can't read that part because it's off of the page. I think it's my glamour of my lordship had overwhelmed, fled far overseas and perished. My campaign, I besieged, and he lists all these cities. And because they did not bow their feet to me quickly enough, I conquered them and carried off their spoils and their officials and their politicians and their common people. And he gets down here and he talks about Hezekiah the Jew. He said Hezekiah, put Pattai in prison unlawfully, as Pattai was his enemy, had become afraid of all the kings of Egypt. And so what he says about Hezekiah, I fought with them and afflicted defeat upon them. As for Hezekiah the Jew, he did not submit to my yoke, so I laid siege to 46 of his strong cities, his walled forts, and up into the courtyards and the villages and all the vicinity, and I conquered them. Himself I made a prisoner in Jerusalem, in his royal residence, like a bird in a cage. So here, Sennacherib's really touting his power and his ability to overrun the entire region. It's really interesting, though, because when you look at these prisms and these annals that the Syrian kings kept records in, they always wrote down what they accomplished, but they didn't ever write down where they failed. So it's very interesting that he didn't say that he didn't say, I was not able to take Jerusalem. He said that he locked up Hezekiah in his royal residence in Jerusalem. So what does that tell you? That tells you that he was not able to take Jerusalem. So the question remains, and it's a very interesting question, is why was he not able to take Jerusalem? because the Bible here, it says that in Micah that he was able to take Judah and the 45 cities up to as far as Jerusalem. Well, the historical data supports that Sennacherib's invasion of Judah did not include Jerusalem. The biblical data states that an angel of the Lord killed 185,000 of Sennacherib's soldiers. So I want us to look at 2 Kings chapter 19, and I'm going to read this. And this from the biblical account. This is what we're not going to get this information in Taylor's prism, but the scriptures records what happens here. So in 2 Kings 19, verse 20, it says, Then Isaiah, son of Amos, sent a messenger to Hezekiah. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I have heard your prayers to me about King Sennacherib of Assyria. This is the word of the Lord has spoken against him. Virgin daughter Zion despises you and scorns you. Daughter Jerusalem shakes her head behind your back. Who is it you mock and blaspheme? Against whom have you raised your voice and lifted your eyes in pride? Against the Holy One of Israel. You have mocked the Lord through your messengers. You have said, with my many chariots, I have gone up to the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon. I cut down its tallest cedars, its choice cypress trees. I came to its farthest outpost, its densest forest. I dug wells and drank water in the foreign lands. I dried up all of the streams of Egypt with the soles of my feet. Have you not heard? I designed it long ago. I planned it in days gone by. I now brought it to pass, and you have crushed fortified cities and piles of rubble. Their inhabitants have become powerless, dismayed, and ashamed. They are plants of the field, tender grass, grass of the rooftops, blasted by the east wind. But I know you're sitting down and you're going out and you're coming in and you're raging against me, because you're raging against me and your arrogance have reached my ears. I will put a hook in your nose and a bit in your mouth. I will make you go back the way that you came. This will be a sign to you. And then he talks about the sign in verse 30. In verse 33, therefore, this is what the Lord says about the king of Assyria. He will not enter this city. Shoot an arrow here, or come before it with a shield, or build up a siege ramp against it. He will go back the way that he came, and he will not enter this city. This is the Lord's declaration. I will defend this city, and I will rescue it for my name's sake and for the sake of my servant David. Verse 35, that very night the angel of the Lord went out and struck down 185,000 in the camp of Assyria. When the people got up the next day, there were all dead bodies. So King Sennacherib of Assyria broke camp and left. He returned home and lived in Nineveh. One day, while he was worshiping in the temple of his god Nisroch, his sons struck him down with the sword and escaped to the land of Arat. Then his son Esarhaddon became king in his place. So we see that all of the pomp and all of the pride of this Assyrian general was put down by God, and he did not allow Jerusalem to be taken. If you remember the story, if you know your Old Testament, then you'll know that it was 150 years later that Jerusalem in that region was taken by the Babylonians into captivity, because they still did not relent in their idolatry, and they were taken as a whole people to Babylon. That's if you remember Daniel, he was part of that group, and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was a part of that group, and that's where they were taken captive for 70 years, and they were later freed by the Persians, and they went back and built the city. And So we could go on. I'll continue the rest of the chapter 1, but I hope that you're beginning to really understand the somberness and seriousness of how God, in terms of how God considers idolatry and His people participating in it. When Jesus came on the scene in the first century, one of the things that we see Him doing continually is not only correcting the theology of the religious people, but He's even telling them, you are sons of Satan. You are heaping laws upon people and you're not even keeping them. And so he had said to them that they were really participating in idolatry in terms of the law. So this is just to say that we can make anything out of an idol. They thought because they kept the letter of the law and pushed that upon the rest of the people, that they would be okay. But they failed to have a relationship with God. They failed to obey. And so Jesus was very aggressive with them. So as we start thinking about, how, or at least our role in the corporate body of believers, we need to be asking ourselves, how are we participating in idolatry, if at all? Well, we're going to actually get kind of deep into that. And in order to do that, I want to read, as we close here, this portion of this book. This is a really good book. It's called We Become What We Worship. This will help you to begin to see perhaps some of the activities that go on in at least the American church that we can consider as idolatry. If I were to ask you, what would you name as idolatry? I would be so curious to hear what your answer would be. But here is a good read touching on that topic. And this is on 294. It says, David Wells has narrated the contemporary church's enslavement to the worshiping of self and not God, and how many evangelical preachers psychologize the scriptures in their preaching in order to be more practical and to meet the felt needs of modern congregations. One of the results of that among such preachers, sin is spoken of more in terms of personality flaws or fables even, with no moral connection. Wells says that this is none other than the transformation of the Christian faith, which is enormously appealing to the modern people who are typically preoccupied with their own inward worlds, and they just want fixes. I don't know if you've ever heard the term navel gazing. Navel, like your navel. This is what self-idolatry is you're looking at yourself all the time in every conceivable way, and you're only concerned with yourself. A good definition of self-idolatry is a mind set on self, and that's when you rearrange your whole existence around you and you become the most important thing in your life and your own creator. You get to adopt your own values, you get to live your own life and find your own gifts, and you see that whole self-idolatry development. And so too many churches of today are market-driven, attempting to meet the need of the consumer's desire for idolatrous self-fulfillment. Wells explains on this self-worship syndrome. Listen to this. What is uppermost on the minds is not the moral fabric of life, but how to cope with our wayward personalities, self-doubt, and stages of life, marital stress, and as well as the calamities like job losses and soaring cost in college tuition. These are the things that are intensely real to them and drain their psychological energies. However, while these are not inconsequential matters, they are not the burning moral issues of which the Bible is concerned. What is central to the Bible is the true and the right, sin and grace, God's wrath and Christ's death. What is central to so many people today is simply what offers them internal relief. Much of the church today, especially that part of which is evangelical, is in captivity to this idolatry of the self. This is a form of corruption far more profound than the list of infractions that typically pop up in our minds when we think of sin. We are trying to hold at bay the gnats of the small sins while we swallow the camel of self. That this devotion to the self seems not to be like the older devotion to the pagan gods. The pagan god blinds the church in its own unfaithfulness. The contemporary church is whoring after this god as assiduously as the Israelites did in her darker day. It is baptizing as faith the pride that leads us to think much about ourselves and much for ourselves. And so he says here, do we realize how almost exactly the Baal culture, remember the culture, the Balaamism that was practiced in Micah's day, the Baal culture. Do you realize that almost exactly the Baal culture of Canaan is reproduced in the American church? Baal religion is about what makes you feel good. Baal worship is a total immersion in what I can get out of it. And of course, it was incredibly successful. The Baal priests could gather crowds that outnumbered the followers of Yahweh 20-1. There was sex, there was excitement, there was music, there was ecstasy, there was dance. And so this was the great stuff for them. And what did the Hebrews have to offer in response? The Word. The Word is God. So, but the minute we start advertising faith in terms of benefit, we're just exacerbating the self problem. So this is the problem that we face in the American church is self-idolatry. So I want you to think about that, and as you read Micah, as you're moving on in Micah, a good parallel book to be reading along with this study is Isaiah, and of course Hosea as well. But Isaiah is a good book. Of course, it's a bit bigger than Micah, quite a bit bigger than Micah. But we really want to get the feel of what's going on, and we want to connect that to our day and time and what's going on in our day and time. So although this study may not feel like it's much of an encouraging word, it actually is, because it's helping us to know the God of the Bible and to evaluate ourselves appropriately. And one of the best things about walking with God that you can do is to take an evaluation so you know where you are and where you're going, okay? So I know it doesn't sound like an encouraging word, but it is. Go ahead and continue to pray about it, and I hope that you will keep watching and you keep reading as we will dive deeper into Micah next week. I hope you enjoyed it. You have a great rest of the day. Thanks. Bye.